Okay, so since you've had to hold your questions all day, I think we'll start with questions from the audience, and then depending how that's going, I may pause and try to facilitate some discussion amongst the panelists. But for now, please bring your questions forward.
I have a question. It's actually for Melanie and Allison. I don't believe Allison is with us right now, but we'll sort out what her answer might be in the process. Just to give a little background, when I was listening to Melanie's presentation, all through it, I was yes, that makes. I really like the approach and logical reasoning and how we're projecting that to LLMs and so forth. And so I was in complete agreement throughout. And then I was listening to Allison's presentation, and I was in almost complete agreement throughout. I don't know if I would have called it a category mistake, but based on my understanding of what LLMs do and how they do it, I thought, yeah, that makes sense in terms of what she depicted. So the upshot for all that for me was sort of I agreed that you're both right, and and I wonder if you had the same sense, Melanie, and I mean, how you think, if you've had discussions with Allison subsequently, what her final take on it was.
Yeah, I think that the two positions are not incompatible. We have to be careful when we treat LLMs as intelligent agents because they're very different than humans, and it might not be appropriate to use benchmarks designed for humans to test LLMs. They are a kind of cultural technology, but they also seem to us to exhibit intelligent cognitive capacities. A lot of claims are being made about that. And I think it's, worth investigating. And so I don't see them as fundamentally incompatible. It's possible that they are both. And they're really, I don't think we've had this kind of artifact before. So it's very hard to categorize what exactly they are.
Right. And Allison was saying that she wasn't denying the possibility of intelligent agents in the future. She was just saying LLMs aren't them, which I would agree with. But on the other hand, since we don't know, assuming at some point we will get there, which is a big assumption, but if we do, we don't know exactly what needs to be added to LLMs. My suspicion, you may disagree with this, is LLMs will be a part of it, but something else has to be added. And so it's, what you're doing relative to that kind of testing it regarding analogical reasoning and so forth. We need to keep doing that to see, how far we get.
Yeah, I mean, the word intelligence is obviously not an agreed upon it doesn't have a agreed upon definition. And I think that's, it's very contentious what all these mentalistic words mean in the context of AI and also in the context of biological systems. I think AI is kind of pushing us to better define our terms. And it's really showing how our conceptions of what intelligence is have not really captured what we really want to mean by it. And it's pushing us to change our notions of it.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, this is maybe for Chris, and maybe for Chris to get an opportunity to respond to Margaret with respect to what the questions are that are being asked in biophysics and in biology. And here's just a little example. I mean, in some ways, what you delivered was the kind of physical constraints on living things, and yet the constraints may tell us what they can't do. But what they can do takes on a variety that is underdetermined by that kind of approach. So how they do what they do sometimes is to go around what you might call the physical constraints. Just a simple example that's really cute if I had a picture of baby sea otters. And so there was a study, there's an analysis of what's the minimum body weight for a newborn endotherm, which means if you're trying to keep your body temperature internally, mechanisms to keep your body temperature up, and you're in water, it's much more challenging than it is than if you're in air, right? So aquatic endotherms who give birth in water and have their babies like whales, and sea otters are also considered, and penguins and other things. There's, they're just based on the thermodynamic properties. You shouldn't be able to be an endotherm at anything less than about 5.5 kilograms, but in fact, baby otters are 2. And so what's interesting about that case is that how do they do? They're not violating the laws of physics, but unlike whales who don't get to come out of the water, baby otters are spend a great deal of time on their mother's belly as the otters, float on their backs and keep the newborns out of the water. And so they, in a way, find behavioral ways in order to meet the challenges, which introduces a kind of variety that isn't necessarily accessible from the physical constraint program.
Yeah, great point, and thanks for the question. So there wasn't time to go into it. In one of the papers I referenced, we basically say the whole point is about optimizing a cost function, right? And evolution is doing the work of optimizing that cost function. And at a high level, there's a few costs that sort of always show up. So it's not even necessarily about precluding boundaries. It's actually that the cost function often gives you an optimum somewhere. And so it's not even that life is just running up against a boundary always. It's that it's choosing between two ends of a spectrum and finding an optimum in between. And certain constraints like gravity and thermodynamics and all the rest show up as dominant costs. But then in that paper, we also say you can put as many terms into that cost function as you want, and you can keep making it more and more complicated. And in fact, that may be some of the ways to explain the orders of magnitude variation around one of those scaling laws. So the scaling law is really, there's a dominant set of average, on average, there's a dominant set of constraints. But then the scatter, to explain that scatter, you need to start to add other things to the cost function. So I totally agree with you in many ways. And so the point would be, well, imagine that you're in a strong game theoretic scenario with another species. That may become a dominant cost for you that starts to matter more than some of the physical costs. And that may be some of the scatter that you see in those curves, and you're willing to make those trade-offs, say, against optimal energy efficiency to evade a predator or to produce a toxin or to do any number of things. And in that paper, we discussed that, where we say there's many cases you want to deviate from this. And otters may be the same sort of thing, right? If you're trying to expand into another niche that's amphibious, for lack of a better word, but where you're trying to be both on land and in water, and you have a certain sort of social intelligence and so forth, then there's other strategies, just something you have to add to that cost function. So the physical cost function is really a starting place. It gives you the average behavior, and then you layer on top of that all of these other features to get at the biological variation that we're all interested in. Another way of saying that is a lot of the physical constraints is removing the boring bit so you understand what the interesting biological bit that's left over actually is. But we should start there and see if we can explain the average behavior first. So thanks for that.
Hi. So this is a question for Emily. So first of all, I'm generally very compelled by the argument. I don't like principles of indifference, and I think they're especially specious with these types of self-locating beliefs. That said, I did want to raise a question, which is, this is inspired by a discussion I had with Richard Pettigrew. So Mike Teitelbaum has a paper called "There's Not Enough There," which is basically a generalized version of Goodman's riddle of induction, which basically shows in some sense that when you're doing induction, what rule is rational entirely depends on the predicate, where what's meant to show is like if your evidence base never actually choose between how you should project forward. And of course, if you accept an argument like that, the worry is that all type of induction is sort of arbitrary. Now, in that case, I certainly hope it's wrong. I do think that there's some story about how we use predicates that allow us to make these inferences, but I wonder if there's sort of a proves too much quality to your argument. So when you point that there's no rationally compelling way to choose among them, sort of in some ways, this broader class of arguments is showing that for all these other cases where we update our beliefs probabilistically. So I was wondering if you could say something about how you might pull them apart.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so of course, the problem of induction is a problem for everyone. I'm not going to try to solve it here. But I think one of the things I was trying to do in my argument was specifically explain why self-location is different to the standard non-self-locating case. So in particular, I sort of talked about pragmatic rationality as the type of rationality that is engaged when you first set a goal and then you have various methods to decide how you should act. And whatever you're going to say about those methods, whether that's empirical testing and induction or some kind of theoretical analysis or anything like that, certainly we have some such methods. You may or may not trust them, but they exist. The point about self-location specifically is that there is no such additional step in that case, that you go straight from the goal to the credences. There's no room really for what we would normally call pragmatic rationality to play a role. So insofar as you find our normal methods of pragmatic rationality to be rationally compelling, which I to some extent do, there's a role there for those methods and that kind of rationality to tell you what to do in the non-self-locating case. There just isn't any such role that could possibly be played by pragmatic rationality in the self-locating case.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, so this is for Janan, and so I was very struck by this point that you were making. So I guess the entire thing was about this this interplay between a predictor and the frustrator, or the interference, and then you were making some suggestive comments about how life and cognition may well be based on this interplay between these two things, and that was. So it was making me think about the role of sort of self-representation in cognition, and one thing that struck me in many other contexts is that that I think, so one issue that we often see in large language models, we'll talk about hallucination. I think, I can't remember who it was, probably several people said that it might be better to talk about this as confabulation. And one thing that I've noticed is that, especially with humans, confabulation seems to happen most when we're talking about what's going on in our own mind and what's motivating our own decisions. And I'm wondering, do you think something like this is going to be like a core issue for cognition or for maybe life generally? I mean, so what's the level that we're seeing this interplay about the predictor and the frustrator in? Do you want to see this as some sort of core for what we're thinking of as intelligence, or for life more generally, or what?
So I mean, I think the emphasis I give is a slightly different one than you did. I mean, I started with the predictor and the kind of counter-predictive device, but that was just meant to kind of create a puzzle that brought out the role of interference. And interference ultimately ends up being this fact that when you're representing the world from inside, there are facts about the world you can't stabilize independently. So what that means is that effectively, so I mean, the negative interference is really just a way of putting your finger on that. And then the question is, so what does that do? I think the way that I think of it is, what is the epistemic attitude? The epistemic attitude is precisely one where you're in the regime of there's something there or there anyways, and I'm trying to get my beliefs to fit it. And I'm suggesting actually when you're a system in the world and you're representing your own environment in ways that depend on your behavior, and because your behavior depends on your own representations, you're kind of in the regime of not being in the epistemic attitude. Why does that matter? It matters in a lot of ways. I mean, I think for me, a big part of it is this sort of picture that we have in the world that comes from taking this kind of God's eye view, taking ourselves out of nature and imagining that we're always in the position of the epistemic, we're taking an epistemic attitude. So in one way, I mean, philosophically, the broad point was partly to make a room for agency and then to show that for embedded agents, that regime, the regime of the interferer rather than the mere representer, is absolutely what all of cognition is organized around. So that was kind of the emphasis that I would give it. The stuff about the predictor and counter predictor, that was just a kind of narrative way of kind of, sort of getting you into the space where you see that cognition is not primarily about truth and representation, but representation is kind of handmade to effective intervention.
Yeah, and this now suggests connections to me to Ruth Chang's work on hard decisions, and how deciding in cases of incomparability is part of how we create our desires, rather than trying to be about a process of figuring out what is correct on the basis of our desires.
That's right. Yeah, but she's already well in
Yes.
in that realm. So this was meant to be, if you're
Yes.
starting from the point of view of somebody who thinks a deterministic world, there's no room
Yeah.
for something like that, or that's some sort of secondary, sort of misdescription of the situation. I'd say that absolutely not. The pure deterministic picture breaks down in the sense that you're going to end up in this situation of choice rather than simply prediction.
Yeah. Great. Thanks.
Hi, this is, I hope, a simple question for Michael. The examples that you showed, I think, were all of children actively participating with each other. And I'm wondering at what stage or when does it become a little bit more abstract? When would children watch a video and say, that's unfair?
Yes,
Something
I'm,
like
so,
that.
I'm
That
sorry.
gives rise
I'm sorry. I got a little hurried at the end there. Our talk in 30 minutes. We'll do that every time. But the last video I showed where the kid says he cheated. That's wrong. That's right. He's not involved. He's at a third party. He's not watching a video, but he's watching this other guy playing the game. And again, I didn't have time to elaborate on that, but why does he care? Why does he care if you play the game right or wrong? And the reason is, in our culture, this is the way we do things. This is the way they learned how to play the game. This is the way it ought to be played. So even from this third party perspective, they start this judgment. And it's around 3 to 4 years of age where they start doing that. And they'll correct people all the time. We use puppets because they're a little bit shy about correcting adults, but they'll correct puppets quite readily.
Okay, I have a question for Emily. I should say at the beginning that I'm a fan of self-locating indifference, so I have a different point of view than Emily. I want to raise an example in turning this pragmatic idea of betting. Let me try to make the context as simple as possible. Let me imagine there are just two possible observers who are in the same subjective state that I know that I'm in, and I'm trying to decide what are the odds that I'm the one on the left or the one on the right. I would claim that I can imagine somebody comes up to me and offers a bet, and the bet would have the form, if you guess you're the one on the left and you're right, you get X. If you guess you're the one on the other side, the right, I think, you get Y. And if you lose, you pay me Z. Then I think I'm perfectly free to try to evaluate X, Y, and Z in terms of how much value they are to me. And that's the place where I would take into account, for example, the fact that money isn't worth much to a Boltzmann brain. So I would devalue the Boltzmann brain winning. So I assign a V for each of these three options. A V that would be a function of X, Y, or Z, the value of each of those things. But I would claim that once I decide on the value of everything, I could then ask for this given bet, what is the expectation value of my change in value if I make the bet? Is it positive or negative? And I would claim that there's a unique set of probabilities that optimizes the result of such a bet for all bets, and that's to choose them equally. And when in calculating these expectation values, it's always the probability that I win times the value that I win. And they're two separate factors.
Yes. So, I mean, I think what you're sort of gesturing at is that the way I presented this problem is that when you're deciding what bet to place in the self-locating situation, you're maximizing what I wrote as some weighted sum of the utilities attached to the winnings for various people. And I think, as you correctly point out, there is some freedom to kind of move things around a little bit between the weights and the utilities. I sort of had a set of fixed utilities and argued you could sort of change the weights to sort of match how much you care about the different people. Alternatively, you could just put how much you care about different people into the utilities and just weight them all equally. It makes no difference in the end to the argument that I was making, because the point I wanted to make was that all that matters here is how much is what your goal is. Once you have decided what you want to achieve in terms of who's going to win how much money, there is no further question about what you should believe. There's no empirical test that you need to do. There's no theoretical analysis you need to do. All that matters here is how much you care about the winnings for these various observers. And that is what will completely determine the credences that you should have by this method. So my claim here is just that those credences do nothing other than record how much you care. They don't record any kind of physical fact. They don't record any kind of theoretical fact. They are just a measure of your caring about these different observers. There's no other role they could possibly play.
Well, how much you care goes into my values. I think they should belong in the values. And then the probabilities certainly matter. If I thought the probability of my being the one on the left was 0, I would never bet on that, no matter how much value I assigned to what I would get if that were right. So the probabilities, I think, certainly have a meaning, and they do matter.
I mean, the way I was defining probabilities here was that the probabilities are the weights that should be attached in the winning strategy. And my point here was simply that if you define probabilities in that practical way, what you will find is that the probabilities are always completely determined by your choice of goal. There's never any further question about what the probabilities should be in that scenario. So in that sense, there are no substantive probabilities there at all. All there is just a measure of how much you care about these people.
Okay, we'll keep you on now. We can talk more later.
So this is a question for Janan. So I wonder if you've thought about whether any important difference hinges on whether the interference is sentient versus non-sentient. And I guess the source of my question is that we've done a lot of predator-prey simulations in open field, and they're very boring. If the predator is a bit faster than the prey dies eventually. If the prey is faster than the predator, then the prey lives forever. But as soon as you add an occlusion, then all bets are off. I mean, at a certain level of occlusions, there's a way of using the partial information that lets strategizers do all kinds of crazy stuff where relative velocities doesn't really matter anymore to some extent. By manipulating the belief state of the other, you can sort of do deception, you can do baiting, all these sorts of things. So I just wondered if you thought about whether there's anything importantly different as to whether the interference is structural, like biogenic or geogenic obstacles, or sentient, like something's hidden inside of the skull of your head so you don't see it because it's neural computation.
So no, I hadn't thought about it. It's a really good question. So I think what matters to interference is just somehow that the representational activity is creating headwinds, that it has to encounter. So I think it shouldn't matter whether it's sentient or not. Mm-hmm. But obviously, so much of actual cognition is based on that kind of interference. So, but it's a really good question.
All right, thanks.
Hi, I have a question for Dr. Tomasello. So thank you so much for your talk. And my question is, when we test chimpanzees, usually...
Speak into the microphone, please.
Sorry, there?
Yeah.
When we test chimpanzees, usually we test them in a condition where they have food ad libitum. And I wonder how this could affect the results on sharing food, thinking that maybe if I'm a chimpanzee and I know that my chimpanzee friends always have the opportunity to eat food constantly in any other moments of the day, whether that will make the sharing food less probable in a testing situation. And I'm wondering whether if they are in a different context, like in a stress context when they do not have food at Livington, that result will change. Also, there are some papers on rats that shows that when they have food at Livington, they don't share food, but when they are restricted from food, they tend to share food more. And I have a second question. Is that okay?
I didn't really hear the first part of it that well. This is when chimps are in what kind of condition? When they're in more...
At Livington, food at Livington. So when we test chimps in a sanctuary or in a zoo.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
The place where the food sharing has been studied most is after they do a group hunting of monkeys. And there, it's a kind of a sharing under pressure. They grab it from one another, and you let them have it, because if you try to keep it from them, then you fight, and everybody else gets the food. So It's kind of reluctant sharing. Some people call it tolerated theft, is the way they share food after hunts.
Nice. Can I ask a second question? Can I?
That's up to the chair.
Yes.
A quick one.
Yes, yes. So I want to ask you about the results of chimpanzees having false beliefs and how that will interact. Like if chimpanzees have false belief, therefore I feel that they will have like the subjective perspective and also the objective perspective from another chimps. And what are your opinions about
Yes,
that?
well, my name is on a paper where Chris is the first author that says they understand false beliefs, but that uses a particular method. And Chris and I disagree about whether that method, what that method tells you. I think it's kind of inside baseball, though, so I think I won't go too much in detail. But I don't think they do understand false beliefs in a human-like way.
Oh, okay, thanks.
All right, thanks all for your very thought-provoking talks. I'm going to try to ask a cross-cutting constellation of questions. So, Chris, you talked about calculating the information processing like efficiency of life. I'm wondering if anybody has ever tried to estimate the overall information processing capabilities of the biosphere over time. My expectation is that that has grown over time, even though I haven't done the calculation, perhaps exponentially, with maybe some step jumps when things like cultural transmission of information emerges. And the reason why I ask this question is because I'm interested in whether or not Janan's hypothesis about interference means that if that curve indeed is growing over time, that it will actually turn over at some point as the cognitive powers of the biosphere grow so large that it has to spend more and more of its processing power on predicting itself with so much interference inherent in there. And then I want to toss it over to Melanie and ask if you think that you would be able to see if that sigmoidal path exists in AI systems as well. So take it away, however you want.
Wait, I'm gonna add a component to that for Simon, which is that you talked about the robustness of like kind of macro level systems as it relates to micro level features of the system. And I'm curious whether interference is something you want to be robust to or a feature of robustness.
So we've done it in the modern world across scale, but haven't done it over time. I think that's an interesting question. I think your intuition is correct that it's increasing in interesting ways. Some of that information processing, like in social systems, even in the human brain, is not fully worked out. So there's hard questions in there, but I think it's a really interesting question.
I don't actually know if there was a component of that for me.
I think it's the measures that we have for information processing are not the same as the measures we have for cognitive processing. And so it's hard to correlate them. You know, people try to measure information processing capabilities of the brain, and it's really different from what the brain actually does in the context of a given dealing with a given situation. So I'm not sure that the question itself is well formed, but I would also say that, you know, you're talking about self-reflection here. AI systems are not designed, at least right now, to have much metacognitive abilities. And it's debatable how much has actually emerged from just learning from language and so on. But one of the things that people in AI feel is one of the missing pieces is sort of this ability for self-reflection. And to do self-reflection, I would say you have to have a sense of self, which these systems do not yet have.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but for those of us who work in complex adaptive systems, we realize that that term is a little bit misleading because it seems to imply that the system itself is adapting, but it's really the agents within it are adapting, and sometimes that can be in conflict with the ability of the system to maintain robustness. There's a trade-off, and in fact, one of the key features of robustness at macroscopic level often is the lack of robustness at finer levels. So, for example, flu strains make their way through our population and come and go, and they're not stable at all. But it's that very lack of robustness at the microscopic level, which is related to what David would be interested in talk about, which is high mutation rates and recombination, which are ways to be continually exploring, like Allison was talking about last night. And it's that constant exploration that often confers robustness at the macroscopic level. So it's a very interesting question to try to relate the macroscopic robustness to what the individual agents are doing, but there's a trade-off there. Does that come close to answering what you were?
Sure.
This is a question directed to Dr. Tomasello. So you mentioned cooperation. It seemed to me as a source of morality, but it seems that, and I just want to see if you have any evidence for this. It does seem that what is uniquely human is using cooperation for deception, and also in a larger way, for violence, genocide. It's uniquely human, it does seem. So first, do you see any evidence precursor of this in chimp societies? And also, it does seem that the culture is really critical in your theories, cultural evolution. And again, it does seem that in human cooperation, rather than being a force for good, it's rather a force for deception, self-deception, and also really at the larger scale, like a genocide. So humans seem to have suppressed inter-individual violence and use it for the extreme group violence.
Right. So once again, we come to this level of the culture as a whole, which was asked about before, the more general abstract version of it. When human cultures emerged, and Claudia referenced this with regard to intergroup competition, human morality, which I didn't really get to, has an in-group, out-group. We're moral in our in-group, and who's the in-group and who's the out-group is actually quite flexible. It depends on context and lots of things. We can, we cooperate in wars. The armies are quite cooperative. They have moral attitudes toward their buddies and whatever, while they're killing the guys on the other side. So in chimps, you see a kind of a defense of territory. They don't like strangers, and they will attack individuals who enter their territory and stuff. But it's not based on group. It's based on just anybody who's unfamiliar. They'll attack. And humans have this group based. They're in the other group. They're a them, and we're a we, and we don't like them.
And is there any evidence of genocide, like in chimp societies?
No,
like a group?
Not that I know of. No.
Thank you.
Hello. I have actually, how do I explain it? So questions for Michael and Simon, and they're kind of interrelated. So question is, most of the experiments that we've seen on human nature and cooperation, they're dyads. What would emerge, and what is predicted to emerge in our large populations? And is that why we have so many issues, like why we're a cancer? And for example, like tragedy of the commons, and many of the lack of cooperation that we see on the broader scale.
So when you look at the literature on cooperation and altruism and things of that sort, you usually start at the bottom talking about high genetic relatedness, and then reciprocal altruism, and then indirect reciprocity. There's a sort of thing Yogi Berra is reported to have said, which is, if you don't go to other people's funerals, they won't come to yours. But then moving up to the development of social norms, and at the higher the level of organization, the more difficult it is to maintain cooperation. And so, and as Michael was suggesting, a lot of the cooperation you find within groups is for the benefit of competition or combat with other groups. And so that's why at the end I talked a little bit about how can we scale up from local competition. And by the way, most of what you see about game theory is about two-player games. Whereas you point out that it's a much more diffuse situation. There is a literature which is developing called mean field games with lots of players, but most of game theory doesn't touch that sort of thing. So that's why Lynn Ostrom, in talking about how we could get cooperation at the international level in dealing with climate change and things of that sort, said you're never going to get 200 countries to agree. So we have to have a polycentric approach where we have small numbers of countries building agreements and then building on that. Those would be building blocks for higher levels. But it gets harder when the relatedness or the commonality of interests goes down. So yes.
I can relate that to humans exactly. So in hunter-gatherer groups, a lot of their cooperation is based on personal experience with one another and reputational things and a little social norms added on the top for extra stability. When you get to civilizations where you have large numbers of people who don't know one another, in-group strangers sometimes called, then you get things like religions where God is always watching. You get laws where you put people in jail. And so you need additional mechanisms when it gets larger, because one of the basic findings in this collective action stuff is the larger the group, the harder it is to keep the cooperation. And so in the human groups, you need these extra mechanisms when it gets larger.
They may not last at the global level.
No, and the jury's still out on whether it's going to work in our case or not. We're adapted. Humans are adapted for small group cooperation, and now it's been scaled up since civilization in these multicultural, complicated societies. And I just say we don't know if it's going to scale up or not.
I wonder if Michael and Simon and anybody else could comment on the role of collective knowledge in that process. Like, I was struck by the fact that, Simon, you said birds pay attention to their 7 neighbors. They're kind of looking at their local environment. And Michael, I was struck that the 3-year-olds have to know how to split 4 equally into 2 equal parts in order for the cooperation game to work. And, you know, when we're dealing with these collective action problems, the problem of collective knowledge is immense.
So yeah, collective knowledge could have several meanings, but for me, I think what your question is directed at doesn't mean that everybody in the group has that knowledge, but it means there's an emergent property, a collective intelligence that emerges. You know, the wisdom of the crowd sort of thing, and there's a growing literature. There's a new journal called Collective Intelligence. There's a growing literature on that. And Elke Weber at Princeton and I have written a paper on this psychology of political polarization and how it relates to individuals belonging to groups, but not all belonging to one group, but belonging to subgroups inside, which then are in competition with other groups.
As usual, I think the human case is a little bit different. So the collective intelligence, collective knowledge is a very broad term. Some of what you're talking about, Simon, I call distributed intelligence, where different individuals in the group know different things and the output is a thing. The collective, in humans, you have, again, this in-group, out-group. So for example, we have studies where if you look at a couple of dolls on the floor and some of them are strange, and one of them is a doll of Santa Claus, and you say to the child, "Oh, wow, I recognize that," they'll get you the Santa Claus, and they've never interacted with you ever before. They just know that people in this culture know who Santa Claus is, and they don't know who these other dolls are. So what they call cultural common ground or cultural collective knowledge is what you know that everybody in the culture knows, even though you haven't actually experienced it with them. So I think there's this distributed stuff that's quite widespread, and this kind of, and other people in other cultures may not know it. So in other cultures, they may not know the English word for this or whatever. Again, it's got an in-group, out-group dimension to it as well.
For Melanie and Janan, I'm wondering if you can comment on. I think Janan made the claim that that intelligence may be designed for interference. In fact, either instead of representation or in addition to representation. And Melanie, I'm wondering. Well, for both of you, I'm wondering if that's something that AI could be designed for, if that's something that could be benchmarked, and Melanie, whether you think that impacts whether AI is or could be intelligent.
So I think that some forms of AI already have that characteristic. I mean, I think my understanding of what Janan was saying is that, you know, our intelligence is to predict the future, but then adjust our actions to make the future more like what we want it to be. And so that's exactly how things like reinforcement learning work and other kinds of AI systems. So in the narrow sense that AI learns, it does have that kind of characteristic. And I think that's absolutely essential. It gets to a kind of question about agency and whether AI systems could actually have like an actual desire or motivation of the kind that we have, rather than just some kind of programmed numerical quote unquote reward that they're trying to achieve. So I struggle with that, what actually agency entails.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, I think that the way that I think of this sort of interference is much more at home in a kind of cybernetic system, you know, where what's going on is the system is acting in the domain it's representing. And when you said, you know, you don't know whether a system, like an AI system, can have goals or desires. I mean, I think part of what I was pointing out is that if you're in the situation where you're acting in the domain that you're representing, you can't simply predict, because nothing will happen unless you act. So in a way, I would expect if you've got a cybernetic system and it's representing the world, that it's going to grow desires or goals. And either in order to even if it's programmed to predict, it's going to do that in order to kind of fill in the holes in the computation.
If I can just say one thing about the cybernetic, which I agree totally. I said they just somebody that if all life on Earth was wiped out, ChatGPT would sit on my desk doing nothing, but my home heating system, run by a thermostat, would keep heating my house to a nice temperature into eternity, because it has a goal, as it were. Sorry.
I have a question for Janan, and maybe in a sense also for Michael Tomasello. So Janan, I'm very much taken with your emphasis on our status as agents embedded in reality. I mean, it seems like there's a sense in which from the dawn of animal life, we have to have some representation of me versus the environment, so that when, for example, you move, you can attribute the change in your sensory stimulation either to something going on out there or something that I have done. So that's a very instinctive distinction that we're making. But if I heard you right, I think you were suggesting that somehow our status as agents who are part of nature and not actually looking at nature from outside somehow made it the case that we're not, I think you said, we're not in the regime of the epistemic attitude. And that seemed to me wrong. I mean, it seems to me part of knowledge from the very beginning that we exploit our embeddedness in reality, even with the first epistemic acts that we perform in groups. For example, initiating acts of joint attention, you point out an object, and I'm exploiting my status as part of this reality here. When I hold up an object, rigidly designating it as this thing here, that's not something I could do if I weren't in this very reality here. So I think that's a question
Yes.
for you,
Okay,
Jenna,
good.
and
Yeah. So
I wonder if you're feeling this also, Mike.
Completely right. That wasn't a blanket statement, that we're never in the position of taking the epistemic attitude. It was meaning that where there is interference, so when I'm reasoning about parts of the world that are dependent on my own representational activity, I'm never purely in the epistemic attitude.
How very good.
Right. So our attitude is in very complicated, subtle ways that depend precisely on how our representations are wrapped into entangled with the causal structure of the things we're representing. We're in some mixture of the epistemic attitude and the choice attitude.
Oh,
So the
that's
idea
great. So,
is,
so it's a mixture. We're not expelling the epistemic
absolutely
attitude.
right.
So you don't want to give up the idea that we can, for example, know what we're doing.
Of course not.
Very
No.
good. Okay, thank you.
I'm fine. You're good.
Great. We are right on time. I'll call up Stephen in a moment, but let's thank all of today's speakers.
I'll ask the last question, but it's for all of us. So organizing a conference, as folks who've done it know, is an incredible amount of work. All of the emails, the meetings, the details, the annoyances. And for those of you who have never done it, you have no idea. So in the spirit of more thanking, plus gratiare, my question is, could we all, one more time for their creativity and imagination and bringing us together, thank Janan and Sean so much.